In the fall of 1969, a 21-year-old Green Beret named Captain William Alra stepped off a helicopter into one of the loneliest corners of the Vietnam War. His new command, Firebase Kate, was perched on a remote hilltop in the central Highlands, only a few miles from the Cambodian border. It wasn't much to look at. A handful of sandbag bunkers, wooden firing pits, and a command shack surrounded by endless jungle. Yet from this exposed ridge, the Americans and their Montagnard allies watched one of the most dangerous infiltration routes in Southeast Asia. To Alra, the posting felt like a test of everything he'd trained for. He was the youngest Special Forces commander in theater, leading just 26 U.S. soldiers and roughly 150 Montagnard fighters. The indigenous tribesmen, farmers and hunters turned warriors, knew every stream and trail that threaded through the Highlands. They were fierce, loyal, and utterly vital to survival in this terrain. Life at Kate settled into a fragile rhythm. Days began with perimeter checks, weapon maintenance, and patrols that disappeared into the thick canopy for hours at a time. Nights were spent listening to the jungle breathe, distant rustling, shifting branches, sounds that could mean anything. Mail arrived rarely, water was rationed, and sleep came only in short bursts. Still, morale held. The men trusted Alra's calm voice and even temper, a quality that carried weight in a place where fear could turn fatal. Firebase Kate existed to monitor what U.S. intelligence called a strategic corridor, a jungle artery the North Vietnamese used to funnel troops and supplies south. Holding it meant denying the enemy freedom of movement. Losing it would open a path straight into the heart of the Highlands. The Americans knew they were sitting on prime ground, and that made them a target. By mid-October, routine became unease. Scouts reported new trails carved through the undergrowth, strange silence where wildlife had once stirred. Even the Montagnards grew quiet, glancing often toward the tree line. To the untrained eye, the jungle looked unchanged. But to those living inside its shadow, it felt like the calm before a storm, the kind that erased entire outposts overnight. What Captain Alra didn't yet know was that thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers were already in the hills around him, watching, waiting, and preparing to close the trap. By late October 1969, signs of trouble could no longer be ignored. Patrols sent beyond the wire returned uneasy, reporting footprints too deep and too many to belong to small guerrilla bands. Abandoned camps revealed cooking fires carefully hidden under brush, evidence of larger, disciplined formations. Alra studied every report that came across his desk. The picture forming was grim. Somewhere beyond the dense tree line, a full North Vietnamese regiment was moving into position. On October 29th, the quiet finally broke. Around midday, the first mortar shells fell. A few at first, the kind of harassment fire every firebase endured from time to time. But then the sky opened up. Dozens of rockets screamed in, followed by hundreds more. The air turned red with dust and smoke as explosions ripped through the perimeter. The NVA gunners had done their homework. Every bunker, every trench seemed to take a direct hit. Inside the chaos, Captain Alra moved from post to post, shouting over the thunder of explosions, keeping men steady. The Montagnard fighters held their ground, firing back in bursts, their shouts mixing with the deafening roar of gunfire. Then came the sound everyone dreaded. Enemy bugles and whistles rising from the jungle. Waves of North Vietnamese soldiers surged toward the wire, disciplined and relentless. The defenders poured fire into the darkness, tracer rounds stitching across the jungle floor. The first assaults were repelled, but more followed. Every lull in the shelling brought another rush of men from the trees. When night fell, the defenders realized the scale of what they were facing. Firebase Kate was surrounded. Radio calls for air support went unanswered. Low clouds and thick fog grounded U.S. aircraft. There would be no gunships, no resupply, no reinforcements. The men were on their own. As the shelling continued through the night, Alra's voice came calmly over the radio net. "Hold your positions. Conserve ammo. We're not done yet." His tone steadied men who could barely hear over the bombardment. For 36 hours, they fought wave after wave, the jungle around them burning under constant fire. By dawn, the perimeter still held, battered but intact. The cost, however, was growing. Ammunition was running low. The wounded crowded the command bunker, and the enemy showed no sign of pulling back. The defenders had survived the first night, but the North Vietnamese weren't finished. The siege of Firebase Kate had only just begun. By the morning of October 30th, it was clear that Firebase Kate was trapped. The jungle around the hilltop had gone eerily still. No birds, no insects, just the distant thump of mortars echoing through mist. The defenders could see movement in every direction now. Enemy silhouettes flickered in the trees, too disciplined to break cover, but close enough to remind everyone that escape was impossible. Alra's radio operators tried repeatedly to reach headquarters. Each message was answered with the same static-filled replies. Hold position. Weather improving soon. But the weather didn't improve. Thick clouds hung low over the Highlands, grounding all aircraft. That meant no ammunition drops, no medevac for the wounded, no air support to push back the tightening noose. The realization sank in slowly. They were alone. Inside the perimeter, the situation was deteriorating fast. Ammunition was rationed bullet by bullet. Water had to be filtered from rain puddles or sipped from shared canteens. Food was down to cold sea rations and scraps. The Montagnard fighters chewed betel nut to stay alert through sleepless nights, while the Americans mixed instant coffee with muddy water just to stay awake. Despite the exhaustion, morale held together barely. The men still trusted Alra, whose calm presence moved like a steady current through the chaos. He didn't sugarcoat the situation, but his voice never shook. He made his rounds, kneeling beside wounded soldiers, tightening bandages, giving quiet nods that said, "I see you. Keep going." As daylight faded again, the enemy launched another coordinated assault. Dozens of mortar rounds landed almost simultaneously, followed by heavy machine gun fire that shredded the outer bunkers. Several positions went silent. Still, the defenders refused to fall back. The Montagnards fought shoulder to shoulder with their American counterparts, firing until barrels overheated and weapons jammed. When the attack finally eased, the firebase was a ruin of smoke and shattered timber. Fires burned across the compound. Some men lay wounded in the open, unable to be reached until dark. The radio crackled with fragmented messages. Nearby U.S. units wanted to help, but none could reach them through the encirclement. That night, Captain Alra gathered his senior men in the command bunker. The look on their faces said everything. They couldn't hold much longer. And yet, none of them suggested surrender. The plan was simple: survive one more night, no matter what it took. What they didn't know was that by the next evening, one more night would become a choice between annihilation or an escape through hell itself. By the third day, the defenders at Firebase Kate had reached the edge of survival. Ammunition was nearly gone. The wounded were piling up, and the radio brought only one repeating message: no extraction possible. Outside the wire, the North Vietnamese were tightening the circle, their voices and movement now so close that the men could hear them talking through the trees. The jungle had become a cage. Captain Alra stared at the map spread across his field desk, the lamp flickering weakly beside him. Staying meant certain death. Reinforcements weren't coming. Helicopters couldn't break through the weather, and headquarters had already gone silent. There was no more strategy to discuss, no miracle solution. There was only one decision left to make: abandon Firebase Kate. That night, he called his senior NCOs together and laid out the plan. They would destroy everything that couldn't be carried, move under full darkness, and break east toward a clearing that might serve as a pickup zone if the skies cleared. The Montagnard scouts would lead the way. They knew every inch of the terrain. The wounded would be carried. No one would be left behind. Just before sunset, the men began preparing. Radios were smashed. Maps were burned. Spare equipment was buried or rigged with explosives. It felt wrong to destroy the place they'd fought to defend, but there was no choice left. When darkness finally fell, the jungle lit up one last time, controlled detonations marking the firebase's end. At midnight, the first column slipped silently into the trees. Each man carried only what he could move with: a rifle, a few magazines, and a canteen. They moved in single file, one hand on the shoulder of the man ahead, guided by faint starlight breaking through the canopy. Every step was a gamble. NVA patrols were everywhere. One sound, one flash of movement, could bring an ambush that would wipe them out before they reached open ground. Several times, they froze as enemy voices passed within meters. The Montagnards whispered quiet warnings, and Alra signaled them forward again. Progress was slow, agonizingly slow, but discipline held. By 3 a.m., they reached the final ridge overlooking a small clearing, their extraction point. The men dropped to their knees, exhausted, waiting for the sound of rotors that might never come. As dawn crept over the jungle, the only question left was whether rescue would arrive, or whether Firebase Kate's last survivors would vanish into the mist forever. For hours, the men lay in the mud at the edge of the clearing, clutching their weapons and scanning the sky. Every sound from the jungle could have been an enemy patrol, every shadow another trap waiting to spring. The silence felt unbearable. They'd escaped the firebase, but not the danger. Then, just after dawn, a faint rhythm began to echo through the valley. The deep, unmistakable thump of helicopter rotors. First, no one spoke. They barely dared to hope. Then the sound grew louder, and the first UH-1 Huey broke through the clouds, hovering low above the treetops. Another followed, then another. The survivors of Firebase Kate erupted into motion. Colored smoke grenades hissed, marking the pickup zone. Pilots, flying blind through fog and crossfire, brought their aircraft down into the small clearing, the blades whipping the jungle into chaos. Enemy gunfire erupted from the hills. Bullets ripped through the trees as the Montagnards and Americans formed a defensive ring, returning fire with what little ammunition they had left. One Huey took a hit and spun sideways before leveling out, still holding position. Alra moved from man to man, shoving the wounded toward the choppers first. He didn't board until the last of his men were loaded. As the final helicopter lifted off, tracer rounds streaked past the open doors. The hill that had been their salvation moments earlier was now an inferno. Below them, Firebase Kate, the outpost they defended for 3 brutal days, was gone, swallowed by fire and smoke. But against every odd, the majority of its defenders were alive. When they landed at a nearby base hours later, the scene was quiet. Medics rushed the wounded to triage tents. Others collapsed where they stood, too numb to speak. There were no cameras, no reporters, no speeches. Just relief, exhaustion, and the unspoken knowledge that they'd done the impossible. Escaped a siege that should have ended in annihilation. In the following days, fragments of the story reached command posts across Vietnam. Officers shook their heads, amazed anyone had survived. Official reports labeled Firebase Kate as abandoned, but those who'd been there knew better. They hadn't abandoned it. They'd fought until survival itself became the only victory left. Years later, the world would forget about Firebase Kate. But for those who lived it, the young captain, his men, and their Montagnard allies, the echoes of that hilltop would never fade. When the survivors of Firebase Kate finally returned to friendly lines, there were no parades or medals waiting. The war rolled on as if nothing had happened, and the outpost they'd fought to defend was quietly erased from maps. Captain William Alra was reassigned within days. His men dispersed among other units. For a long time, what happened on that isolated ridge in the central Highlands existed only in memory, spoken about quietly, if at all. To the military, Kate was just another loss in a war filled with them. But for those who'd been there, it meant something deeper. They remembered the faces of the Montagnard fighters who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with them, the voices on the radio that faded into static, and the silence afterward. They remembered the smell of wet earth, the sound of mortars walking closer each hour, and the unspoken promise that they wouldn't leave each other behind. For Alra, the war ended, but the memory didn't. He came home, left the army, and tried to live a quiet life. Yet the siege haunted him, not as a tale of heroism, but as a test of leadership under impossible odds. He'd made decisions that saved lives, and others that cost them. At just 21, he'd carried a weight that would follow him for decades. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the story resurfaced. Author Marvin Wolf learned about Firebase Kate from veterans who still spoke of that young captain who wouldn't quit. At first, Alra resisted revisiting it. But when the book Abandoned in Hell was finally published in 2015, the forgotten story of Firebase Kate reached the world at last. Readers were stunned, not just by the scale of the siege, but by the quiet courage that had carried those men through it. Historians began to look again. What had seemed like another obscure outpost fight was, in truth, one of the most remarkable small unit actions of the Vietnam War. A handful of Americans and their Montagnard allies had held off a force 20 times their size, and escaped alive. Captain Alra never called himself a hero. He said he'd only done what any soldier would have done: protect his men and get them home. But those who served with him remembered something else. A leader who stayed calm when the world collapsed around him. Firebase Kate may have vanished from the maps, but its legacy endures. A testament to courage, endurance, and the will to survive when every path forward burns away.